Well folks, you apparently like hearing me talk about Spider-Man, which is convenient since I love talking about Spider-Man.
They love me.
So after covering most of the films, including No Way Home, I decided it was time to go back to my Spidey roots with the show that introduced me to the character properly. 1994's Spider-Man the Animated Series. And I know I'm not the only one who grew up on this Spidey. For the better part of a decade, this was the definitive version of the character for so many kids, basically until Raimi's first Spider-Man film released in 2002. And I think you can actually see a lot of this show's influence in how the Raimi trilogy was approached and executed. But the big question I had going in was, does Spider-Man the Animated Series hold up? Or is nostalgia altering my memories? Well, let's find out. So Spider-Man the Animated Series is actually a part of a larger Marvel animated universe that began in 1992 with X-Men the Animated Series. While the franchise consisted of 8 separate shows, the 2 most popular are undeniably X-Men and Spider-Man. In fact, Marvel is actually following up the 90s X-Men animated series next year with a sequel series called X-Men 97, which is fitting because nearly every single series in the Marvel animated universe actually ended on a cliffhanger, including Spider-Man, but we'll get there. All of these series actually intertwine more or less, and a ton of the Marvel heroes from these other series cameo in Spider-Man at one point or another. It's kind of cool that these animated shows were dabbling in an interconnected universe so many years before the MCU. These shows were largely an answer to Marvel Comics' financial woes in the 90s. The plan was basically to make animated versions of as many Marvel characters as possible and really capitalize on toys and merchandising, which when watching through Spider-Man is pretty evident. A ton of the characters, vehicles, weapons, costumes, etc. were incredibly toyetic, often straying from their comic book counterparts. Alongside these financial woes came production difficulties. Marvel had the intention of hiring Martin Pascoe to run the series. He was known for his work on Batman the Animated Series, but shortly into production, he was fired. Marvel ended up bringing in John Semper Jr., the first black showrunner to run a Saturday morning cartoon. Semper was quoted saying that he felt he was expected to fail, given the disastrous place the series had been left under Pascoe, but luckily for him and for us, he righted the ship. The show is structured in an interesting way. Season 1 does a great job introducing most of the classic Spidey villains, mostly in one-off episodes, with the occasional 2- and 3-parters in there, but seasons 2, 3, and 4 all have season-long story arcs, and are even labeled as such. Season 2 is Neogenic Nightmare, 3 is Sins of the Father, and 4 is Partners in Danger. This is particularly interesting given that Semper was allegedly forbidden from doing season-long story arcs, but he just did it anyways. The show is really ahead of its time in that regard. Season 1 is nearly perfect in its villain introductions. They genuinely did an amazing job setting up so many of the most important characters in Spidey's Rogues Gallery within the first 13 episodes. The very first sets up Curt Connors and showcases his mutation into the Lizard. Episodes 2 and 3 introduce Norman Osborn, Spencer Smythe, Alistair Smythe, and Kingpin, as well as Smythe's Spider Slayer robots. This is a good example of the toyetic nature of the series, and while as an adult I think these bots are kinda cheesy, as a kid I remember wanting these toys so bad. I really love the way these episodes set up the major players in New York's upper echelon of powerful men by featuring Norman Osborn and Wilson Fisk. While Norman obviously plays a big role, there's no question that Kingpin is the villainous glue that holds most of this series together, which I think was such a smart move. I've always really loved Kingpin as a Spider-Man villain, largely due to this show. He's the brains and financial backing behind so many of the Spidey villains throughout the series, and this works really well. He's smart, strong, and a master manipulator. In the 4 subsequent episodes, they establish Doc Ock, Mysterio, Scorpion, and Kraven, and all of them stay pretty true to the comics. This first season just has a really great economy of storytelling. We're introduced to so many villains very quickly, but it never feels rushed. I think the smartest thing they did in season 1 was give the Venom arc a full 3 episodes. The alien costume parts 1 through 3 are really great, and they honestly are such a huge reason that kids of the 90s are so attached to Venom as a villain. So many of Spider-Man's most iconic villains were introduced in the earliest days of Spidey comics. Chameleon, Vulture, Doc Ock, Sandman, Lizard, Electro, Mysterio, Green Goblin, Kraven, Scorpion, Rhino, Shocker, and Kingpin all made their debuts in the comics in the 1960s. Many of them were conceived alongside Spider-Man himself, which is really just a credit to the genius of Stan Lee and Steve Ditko. They cranked out so many all-time villains right alongside Spider-Man. Venom, however, stands out as easily Spidey's most iconic villain who wasn't a part of his original Rogues Gallery. The symbiote suit wasn't introduced until 1984, and Venom until 1988, decades after most of Spidey's other iconic foes. And while Venom's rise in popularity already dominated comic books in the late 80s and early 90s, I think it's very fair to say that his appearances in the animated series went a long way to solidify him as a Spider-Man staple. He was introduced in season 1 alongside many of Spidey's iconic foes. I know that as a kid, I had no idea Venom was a relatively new villain compared to the rest. I always just saw him as another great longtime foe in Spidey's rogues gallery. This is likely also what led to his forced inclusion in Spider-Man 3. So many of the kids who flooded the theaters for the Raimi trilogy grew up on the 90s Spidey show, and I know that personally I was eagerly awaiting Venom's introduction. It's just a shame that Raimi was forced to use the character against his will. But I think the animated series' influence on Spider-Man 3 is very apparent. In fact, the introduction of the symbiote suit in both the film and the TV series are very similar, showing the symbiote attach itself to Peter while he's having an upsetting dream, followed by Peter waking up in the symbiote suit while hanging from a building, seeing the new suit for the first time in the building's reflection. As far as I know, the suit was never introduced this way in the comics, as its first appearance was on Battleworld during Secret Wars. Like I said before, this animated series definitely influenced a lot of what went into the Raimi trilogy, but we'll touch on more of that as we move on. The season wraps up with a two-parter about Hobgoblin and a finale focusing on Chameleon, pretty effectively introducing around 9 to 10 villains in just 13 episodes. The way the show handled Hobgoblin was pretty interesting as well. There's a great video by Comic Tropes about the history of Hobgoblin and how infighting amongst Marvel's editors actually ruined the character's potential back in the 80s. Highly recommend checking that video out. But basically, the question of the character's identity was this incredibly engaging ongoing mystery, but due to infighting and disagreements, the ultimate answer to who Hobgoblin was, Ned Leeds, proved incredibly ineffective and made very little sense. But what made the character's initial run so great was the mystery of who was behind the mask, and Spider-Man the Animated Series basically took this opportunity to maintain that same mystery across much of the show until his eventual identity reveal, which was not Ned Leeds this time. But it's also interesting that they opted to introduce Hobgoblin before the much more iconic Green Goblin, and while this switch may have upset longtime Spidey fans, I think it actually made a lot of sense for this show. We basically get an engaging Goblin villain at the top of the show while they were able to set up Norman and Harry Osborn's arcs. This allowed time for the Green Goblin transformation in season 3 to be much more impactful on the audience, and also allowed the Hobgoblin identity mystery to play out over a longer period of time. So season 1 is really great, but I think most importantly, the show's Peter Parker is just a great iteration of the character. He's a stand-up guy who always tries to do the right thing, even though he laments when the right thing gets in the way of his happiness. The character's problems always boil down to a difficulty balancing life as Peter Parker and life as Spider-Man, as any good Spider-Man story should do. They really put him through the ringer, but we'll talk about more of that as we go on, because there's a lot. And the quips, man, they're just full of the best kind of cheesy 90s one-liners. I love them.
Yeah, anyway, this lizard thing is probably just an urban myth. Looks like I was myth-taken.
Can't you pry this thing off?
You want a trial separation already? I understand, but I'm hurt.
Enjoying the flight?
Some flight! No peanuts?
And though the show doesn't utilize Gwen Stacy at all, they do a pretty effective job bringing tension to Peter's love life, with his primary love interests in season 1 being Felicia Hardy and Mary Jane Watson. They even recreate the iconic MJ introduction from the comic books.
Face it, Tiger. You just hit the jackpot.
Overall, I really like season 1. It's basically just a very strong adaptation of tons of Spidey's villains and stories, and it introduces the world and its characters super effectively. The show is very 90s, which is kind of unavoidable, and was even subject to some pretty stupid censorship, which we'll talk more about as we go on, but this first season is among the strongest Spider-Man adaptations that exist in my opinion. And while I do really enjoy a ton of what the show does for the remaining 4 seasons, you can see where things start to fly a bit off the rails starting in season 2. The title for this season's arc is Neogenic Nightmare. Neogenics is the term used surrounding any sort of DNA-altering science in the show. The Neogenic Recombinator is the device that zapped the spider that bit Peter, giving him the spider powers. They basically use this tech to explain a lot of Spidey villains in the show, usually involving DNA splicing with animals in some way. The Lizard was born of neogenic tech, same with Scorpion, but in season 2 they really ramp things up. There's basically this very weird ongoing story where Peter's spider mutations are going haywire. Eventually they make him grow 4 extra arms, and later he even starts to mutate into a full-blown giant spider. It is wild stuff. The other primary neogenic focus is Michael Morbius, which is actually quite a departure from his comic book counterpart. Morbius is basically a straight up vampire in the comics, but due to the aforementioned 90s censorship, Morbius was stripped down significantly. He was not allowed to be a true vampire. They basically molded his origin around the neogenic theme this season, imbuing imbuing him with bat powers, kind of the same way that Peter got his spider powers, which effectively turns him into a vampire. It gets pretty hilarious though, because though he is a vampire, Morbius wasn't able to be shown craving or sucking blood as you'd expect a vampire to do. So instead, they gave him these very weird holes in his hands that he used to like suck blood out of people, but they couldn't even say blood. So how did they get around this?
I hunger for plasma.
Maybe he's getting weak from lack of plasma.
I need more plasma.
Plasma! This is so funny, especially because the theme song of the entire show says spider blood, radioactive spider blood, over and over again. Why aren't they allowed to say blood here? Man, censorship sure is dumb sometimes. Speaking of, the first couple episodes of Season 2 actually bring in the Sinister Six, except that same censorship didn't allow them to even be called the Sinister Six, changing their name to the Insidious Six instead, which just feels ridiculously arbitrary. We can't say the word sinister?
My Insidious Six.
You're Insidious Six.
This version of the Six features Rhino, Shocker, Doc Ock, Mysterio, Scorpion, and Chameleon, who are all hired by Kingpin as usual. It's a pretty solid lineup, though notably it only features 2 of the original Sinister Six lineup. Interestingly, the animated series wasn't actually allowed to use Sandman or Electro at this time, because they were planned to be used in a Spider-Man film that was being developed by James Cameron. Though weirdly, that script also featured Green Goblin and Doc Ock, who were both utilized in the animated series, so I'm not sure why they weren't allowed to use Electro or Sandman. It's possible that they didn't want to use them because their identities were actually different in the Cameron treatment. That whole failed project is wildly interesting. I was actually going to say I should make a video about it, but I just looked it up and there are like 6 already. They also start to bring in a bunch of other Marvel characters in this season, namely the Punisher, Blade, and a 2-part crossover with the X-Men. But I think the way they wove these characters into the story actually felt really natural. When Spidey's mutations start to flare up, he seeks help from Professor X, a really smart and effective way to cross them over without feeling shoehorned. When his mutations give Spidey extra arms and make him look like some kind of monster, the Punisher shows up and tries to apprehend him. And then when Morbius enters the picture, this draws the attention of none other than Blade, the vampire hunter. Though I gotta say, in the first scene where they introduced Blade, I fully had to pause because it looked like they made him white. I think they messed up the color in this scene a little bit, but even after, he does not look like his comic book counterpart. He is way lighter. I'm curious if this was network meddling or just a design choice. Either way, it really threw me off. Blade is a prime example of how they made some of the characters more toyetic too, giving him a cool motorcycle and replacing his katana with a literal lightsaber, though it is kind of weird to take the blade away from Blade, isn't it? Interestingly, this show introduced a mentor character for Blade as well, named Whistler, who never appeared in the comics, but did go on to appear in the 1998 Blade film a few years later. Spidey and Blade team up to stop Morbius, who wants to use the Neogenic recombinator to transform everyone into vampires, starting with the woman he loves, Felicia Hardy. Definitely big Lizard from Amazing Spider-Man energy here. I actually really like that they wrapped up Morbius's initial arc with the Felicia/Morbius angle here. Morbius's main source of grief over becoming a vampire is that it ruined his relationship with Hardy, and his main motivation in turning her into a vampire is to allow them to be together again. But Felicia gets through to the man inside the vampire and changes his mind.
I must get help to be changed back to my human self.
Unfortunately, he's hit with the recombinator himself again, and this time it fully transforms him into a giant bat monster. It's actually an effectively tragic story, even more tragic than the fact that there's actually a Morbius solo movie coming out this year.
I'm just kidding, it's Dr. Michael Morbius at your service.
Honestly, some of my favorite moments in this show are when they get wildly cheesy, like this final moment in the Morbius arc.
Goodbye, Felicia.
The season takes a little bit of a detour into the mystical after they wrap up the Morbius story, introducing Silvermane and the Tablet of Time. In the comics, Silvermane sought an ancient tablet to achieve immortality, which was slightly molded in the animated series to instead de-age Silvermane to his youth, creating one of the funniest developments in the entire series.
Please, somebody help me!
Incredible! He wanted his youth back. He got it.
This whole Tablet of Time storyline leads directly into the introduction of the Vulture, a portrayal that is easily one of my least favorite aspects of the animated series. They introduce Adrian Toomes as yet another youth-obsessed villain who uses the tablet tech to temporarily steal the youth from other people, making Vulture unrecognizable when he's in action. I'm guessing this was an adjustment made for the merchandising side of things. An old man in a bird costume probably isn't the most desirable action figure for kids, but the whole youth-stealing gimmick just felt so out of place for the character. It's a real hat on a hat. It does lead to this old man Peter Parker episode, which was kind of a fun aspect of the gimmick, and it pretty effectively ties into the ongoing Neogenic storyline by solving Peter's mutation problems. Basically, when Vulture steals Peter's youth, he also steals the mutation, eventually turning into a full-blown spider monster. And though it's a tad convenient, Doc Connors manages to transfer Peter's youth and abilities back without the monster mutation, solving that issue once and for all. Like I said earlier, this season does fly a bit off the rails with all of this Neogenic stuff, but that doesn't mean it isn't fun. While some of the plot lines surrounding everything are a bit silly, I think they do a great job with character development and relationship drama. As usual, this season showcases Peter's inability to be a consistent aspect of Mary Jane's life due to his superhero obligations. We see early on that Peter has to blow off MJ when his mutations start to act up, which sucks, but when you got 4 extra arms, you don't really have a choice, do ya? Felicia becomes less of a love interest for Peter this season due to her relationship with Morbius, but this is another storyline that directly leads to further complications with MJ. After Morbius disappears, MJ sees Peter comforting Felicia and grows jealous, which leads to her starting a relationship with Harry Osborn. I just appreciate how the relationship dynamics are fully intertwined with the superhero stuff, rather than feeling like a barely related subplot. Even when some of the Spidey storylines get goofy, they're able to anchor it with great character drama. They even end the season with a major MJ/Peter beat. MJ is supposed to meet her father for the first time since her childhood and wants Peter to be there with her, but when Peter arrives, MJ has vanished into thin air. This is the first of a few times MJ disappears over the show, so be ready for that. Season 3's seasonal arc is called Sins of the Father, and if I'm being honest, it feels like this one is tied together through themes and subject matter more so than it is one continuous story arc. But that isn't necessarily a bad thing, because they managed to tell a lot of great stories focusing on paternal relationships. There are also a couple of really interesting through lines that lead to huge moments in the series. One of these important threads is the appearance of Madam Web, who is a bit abrasive and very mysterious, hinting that she'll need Peter for some important mission in the future. We also get some more Marvel cameos in this season, including Doctor Strange, Daredevil, and Iron Man. But the Sins of the Father theme brings us stories about Richard and Wilson Fisk, Alistair and Spencer Smythe, Robbie and Randy Robertson, the Silvermanes, MJ's absent father, and probably most importantly, Norman and Harry Osborn. While I sort of missed the more serialized storyline for Season 3, I really appreciated that they took the opportunity to tell these stories through the paternal theme. The very first episode, which follows up the cliffhanger about MJ's disappearance, pretty immediately dives into these themes. It turns out MJ was kidnapped and brainwashed by a cult led by Baron Mordo, who pretends to be her father, but is really just trying to unleash his master Dormammu from the Dark Dimension into New York City. This also brings in Doctor Strange, as you might expect, but I still always find it a bit funny when the villain's Spidey fights in this show feel so drastically out of place. Dormammu is such a big mystical concept, and to face off against the friendly neighborhood Spider-Man just kinda tickles me. Especially the way they continue this storyline later in the season, tying it to the Venom and Carnage two-parter, and not bringing back Doctor Strange, instead featuring Iron Man. While I really enjoyed the return of Venom and introduction of Carnage, it felt really strange that they were working to free Dormammu for Baron Mordo. Granted, Carnage couldn't be the full murderous sociopath we know from the comics thanks to censorship, but you'd think that Venom and Carnage would be enough to focus these stories. That being said, they did a really nice job with Eddie Brock's redemption, and though he was a bit stifled from censorship, Carnage was an effectively unhinged villain. The ultimate team-up of Spidey, Iron Man, and Venom to stop Carnage and Brock's sacrifice are executed really well, even if I didn't care for them framing it around Dormammu. But I think their idea was that they'd use this dark dimension aspect of Dormammu to tie into the dimensional portals that become a huge part of the remainder of the season, which is also a big part of the next episode, focusing on the villain The Spot, who was not a villain I knew anything about before watching this. But again, they do a really great job having these episodes lead into one another. The Spot is basically a disgruntled Stark employee who gets shafted when Stark discontinues his portal creating tech. Sound familiar? There's also a solid two-part story with Daredevil, though it feels a bit like a detour this season. These are the stories that focus on Wilson Fisk and his son Richard and their splintered relationship, and centers around Richard framing Peter Parker, who is then defended by Matt Murdock in court. There are some pretty great sequences with Spidey and Daredevil, who I always thought were a great pair for a team up. Though ultimately these stories feel a bit inconsequential in the scheme of the season, other than the fact that Peter learns that Fisk is Kingpin here. But as I mentioned earlier, the big development this season comes in Chapter 4, Enter Green Goblin, and continues in 13 and 14 with Goblin War and Turning Point. They portray Norman Osborn's transformation as a weapons development accident, and I think this episode is another that Raimi's Spider-Man took some cues from. When Green Goblin enters the picture, he starts to kidnap all of Norman Osborn's enemies, not unlike how Goblin gets revenge on the Oscorp board for selling the company in Raimi's film.
Out am I?
These episodes also finally reveal the identity of Hobgoblin amidst his rivalry with Green Goblin, unveiling Felicia Hardy's fiance Jason Macendale as the foe.
Jason Philip Macendale, to be precise.
While the animated series was running, Jason actually was holding the mantle of Hobgoblin in the comics, but he is neither the original intended Hobgoblin, Roderick Kingsley, or the original lackluster character reveal, Ned Leeds. I think this worked relatively well, finally unveiling the identity while giving it some weight in relation to other characters. You've really got a feel for Felicia at this point, falls in love with a man who becomes a giant vampire bat and a murderous flying goblin man, which I think leads really effectively into the seasonal arc in season 4, but we'll get there soon. On top of that, Green Goblin learns that Peter Parker is Spider-Man and uses it against him, which admittedly is straight out of the comics. But the way Turning Point handles this story is really interesting. This is basically their way of doing the death of Gwen Stacy storyline, but obviously with MJ in the place of Gwen. And of course, due to the censorship rampant in the show, they couldn't straight up kill Mary Jane. But the parallel is undeniable. It's Green Goblin on a bridge causing Spider-Man's love interest to fall to their doom. And I have to give them credit for the creativity in how they execute this here. Basically, Goblin has been using this portal technology featured in the previous few episodes. This was how he was able to conceal himself from Spidey and learn his identity. When MJ falls from the bridge, the portal device falls as well, and MJ flies into a portal as the device shuts off in one fell, horribly unfortunate swoop. Man, I gotta give Peter's voice actor, Christopher Daniel Barnes, major credit here, because the desperation and anger in his performance when he loses MJ are top notch.
Mary Jane!
Seeing Spidey hopelessly dive again and again looking for MJ is really tough to watch. So my memory actually failed me here because I remembered this being the series finale cliffhanger, but this was just how season 3 ended. Granted, there's a reason I remember this being unresolved by the end, and we will get there. Season 4 is called Partners in Danger, and once again immediately follows up another MJ disappearance, but this one is much more dire. And once again, Christopher Daniel Barnes' delivery here is haunting. This first sequence goes hard.
Peter, is that you?
No! Mary Jane!
This season is sort of all about partnerships in general, but most pointedly it's about the emergence of Black Cat and her crime-fighting partnership with Spider-Man. I think this was executed exceptionally well and made far too much sense in the context of the series. Both Peter and Felicia have gone through unimaginable loss. Peter obviously losing MJ, and Felicia losing both Michael Morbius and Jason Macendale, the latter to a devastating reveal that he's a murderous psychopath. So having both of these characters find comfort and support in each other is incredibly effective, but with the added layer that while Peter and Felicia know each other in real life, neither of them know each other's secret identities. Spider-Man and Black Cat have a partnership, not Peter and Felicia.
You must think I'm a fool.
I think you are incredible.
And their flirtatious dynamic plays great on screen. Though they're both reeling from their losses, their chemistry is just undeniable. And honestly, they're wildly horny for each other.
Why don't I take off my mask and you take off yours?
I think what's so effective about this is that as an audience member, I am truly invested as them as a potential couple. They feel like a perfect fit for one another. Their chemistry is electric. But with the trauma from losing Mary Jane, Peter is not willing to pursue her further, even if he wants to, with great power and all. Though, let's talk a little bit about Black Cat in this show, because though the way they utilize her relationship with Spider-Man is incredibly effective, they do some wonky stuff with her origin and powers. Though she does have heightened abilities in the comic books, she's mostly portrayed as an acrobatic cat burglar. Felicia was trained in acrobatics and martial arts, and she's granted psychokinesis through science experiments and later through cybernetics, basically the ability to cause her enemies to have bad luck, which is fitting for a Black Cat. But in the animated series, Black Cat's origin is actually from her father's attempts to recreate the Captain America Super Soldier Serum, a strange way to shoehorn in connections to Cap. But even stranger, she can basically engage and disengage her powers at any time, transforming her from the smaller Felicia into the large, muscular, white-haired Black Cat. While I understand they were trying to tie more Spidey stuff into a larger Marvel animated universe, this felt fully out of left field for me. Such a bizarre way to morph Black Cat's powers and origins. Though in the end, I definitely think the more important thing is the character and her relationship to Spidey, and not the origin of her powers. And they pretty much nailed the former. God, when are they going to properly bring Black Cat into a Spider-Man movie? It's actually wild that we're 9 films deep and we've never gotten Black Cat. And no, Felicia in Amazing Spider-Man 2 does not count. Sorry, Felicity Jones. The Spider-Man / Black Cat partnership comes to a close in a pretty wild two-parter focused on vampires of all things. So as you might expect, we get the return of Blade and Morbius, the latter of which obviously throws a big wrench in Black Cat's motivations. They throw a lot into these episodes. Morbius is returned to his vampire form and actively fighting against his desire to suck plasma. Blade finds out his mother is this vampire queen, and then obviously Felicia learning of Morbius's return is a major deal. But it was actually pretty rad to see Spidey, Black Cat, Blade, and Morbius all teaming up to fight these vampires. There's actually a really nice send-off between Spidey and Black Cat.
I need you. I won't let you go.
You will, because I'm asking you to. Do this for me, please.
I'm kind of ashamed to admit, but after watching through this show, Spectacular Spider-Man, and playing the PS4 Spidey game, I think I'm Team Spidey Black Cat as far as ships go, but this final scene with them hits really hard. Black Cat and Peter were each other's support systems after major losses, and now Morbius has returned to Cat, so you can't blame her for reclaiming that lost love. But you can definitely empathize with Peter, who is once again losing someone that he loves.
For now, just remember, I love you.
Cat!
Things get pretty wild from here, and I'm not entirely sure how I feel about the follow-up episode titled The Return of the Green Goblin. We finally get Harry's turn as the Green Goblin, but the way they facilitate it gets pretty silly for my taste. Basically, Norman's version of the Green Goblin, who has been trapped between dimensions since the finale of season 3, sort of telepathically communicates with Harry, basically manipulating him into becoming the new Green Goblin so that he can eventually see his father again. They just don't really do any work to explain the telepathic communication, which is what feels super silly to me, and as far as I know, there's no comic precedent for this. I just prefer the turn for Harry to stem from his own resentment towards Peter and MJ, like we see in the Raimi trilogy and what we were probably going to see in Spectacular Spider-Man, and not from some telepathic manipulation. But this episode also features the mysterious return of Mary Jane. After she was lost in the portal in the season 3 finale, they did briefly show her trapped between dimensions, but we didn't really get any hint of how or why she was able to return, which does come into play in a major way later. But for now, this reunion is really gratifying and propels a major focus of the rest of the season forward, while honoring the theme of the season as well, partners in danger. Peter finally decides to reveal his identity to Mary Jane.
Mary Jane, there's something I've got to show you.
And honestly, even though I just said that I ship Spidey and Black Cat, all of this works really well for me. After seeing Peter's anguish and pain from losing MJ, this is a really heartfelt and meaningful next step. It shows Peter's growth, that he isn't willing to give up his great responsibility, but he's also not willing to be miserable because of it.
I lost you once because I didn't act quickly enough. I'm not gonna make that mistake again. Mary Jane, will you marry me?
Okay, this is actually hilarious though, because MJ's response to his proposal is to jump off of a skyscraper to test that Peter would always be there for her. Really risking it all for love, MJ. The proposal leads directly into season 5, which is structured very differently compared to the last few seasons. Rather than one big arc, it consists of a one-off episode and then 4 smaller arcs. That one-off is Peter and MJ's wedding, then a 5-part arc called 6 Forgotten Warriors, a 2-parter called Return of Hydro Man, a 3-part adaptation of Secret Wars, and then the series wraps up with a 2-parter called Spider Wars. It's honestly a bit of a mishmashed season if I'm being honest. And while there are some aspects of the season I really love, a lot of stuff just didn't quite land for me. The wedding episode is one I really did enjoy, a nice major event for the series condensed into a single episode. You love to see it. And the conflict all stems from some of the drama set up in the previous season. Harry Osborn interrupts the wedding as Green Goblin and tries to force the priest to marry him and MJ. Unhinged, jealous ex-boyfriend behavior for real, which works great for Green Goblin. But the following arc, I'm not a big fan of. This story ties to Captain America's origin and takes some major liberties with Spidey characters in ways that are a bit confusing. I think the coolest thing about the arc is how it resurrects some classic comic book heroes that you might not even know about. Whizzer, Miss America, the Thunderer, the Destroyer, and Black Marvel. All of these characters came about in the 40s under Timely Comics, which would eventually evolve into Marvel Comics, but they are about as classic gets for Marvel. The most famous hero to make it out of the Timely era is undoubtedly Captain America, and though some of these heroes fought alongside Cap back in the Timely days, the animated series ties their origins to him much more directly. Rather than their original origins, here these characters are shown to be follow-up super soldier experiments to Captain America, though they are less powerful as their powers aren't permanent like Cap's are, and are tied up in these rings. On top of that, these rings grant access to a dangerous doomsday weapon, making them highly coveted by villains. It's all a bit convoluted, especially after the show used Black Cat as a different attempt at a super soldier serum parallel. I don't know, it's a lot. These 5 warriors teamed up with Captain America to form the 6 American Warriors. And though I do think it's cool that they wanted to put a spotlight on these old timers, I have to admit I was not particularly invested in this arc. It ropes Red Skull into the mix to face off against the 6 American Warriors, now with Spidey in Cap's place. But truly the most bizarre aspect is how they tie Red Skull to existing Spidey villains. In this version, they reveal that the Chameleon is actually Red Skull's stepson, and he and his stepbrother Reinhold Kragov work together to free Red Skull, which, let's be honest, it's pretty bad, but it isn't the worst thing step-siblings could do.
Step-bro, I'm stuck under the table. Can you help?
Yes, of course I will. Gee, thanks for helping me out from under that table.
But the most bizarre choice here was opting to then make Red Skull's son turn into Electro via this doomsday weapon. Basically, the weapon itself was Electro, a living god of electricity, which is just so far removed from Electro in the comics. They got the costume right, but Red Skull's son, the living god of electricity? Hate me all you want, but I would take Blue Electro over this any day of the week. Alright, now we gotta cover the Hydro Man stuff, and this gets wild. Remember when I said I remembered MJ's disappearance being a series finale cliffhanger? Well, this is why. These 2 episodes show the return of Hydro Man, who formerly dated MJ and was shown to have died in season 2. As it turns out, he was cloned by a scientist named Miles Warren, but this is where it gets nuts. They reveal that not only is he a clone, so is Mary Jane, which is why we never see how she returned from the portal incident. And because she was cloned using a part of Hydro Man, both clones turn out to be unstable, so Peter literally loses MJ again. It just kind of feels like they're beating a dead horse at this point, losing MJ for the 3rd time. But I cannot deny that these final moments are super powerful.
If any part of me is anything like the real Mary Jane Watson, she loves Peter Parker more than anything in the world.
It is wild how much they torture Peter throughout this show. He tends to be put through the ringer in just about every iteration to some degree, but for him to lose MJ 3 separate times over the series is brutal. This is where they transition into their Secret Wars adaptation through Madam Web, which I think had moderate success. Web introduces Peter to the Beyonder, who aims to see what is more powerful, good or evil, by pitting the strongest heroes and villains against each other on a place called Battle World. This concept is straight out of the comics, but the specific characters in this adaptation are condensed and much more Spider-Man the Animated Series centric. You should definitely read up on the original run, but for this adaptation they boiled the heroes down to Spider-Man, the Fantastic Four, X-Men's Storm, Captain America, Iron Man, and Black Cat. The villainous team was Doc Ock, Doctor Doom, Alistair Smythe, the Lizard, and Red Skull. It was definitely cool that they attempted to adapt such a major storyline in the Marvel animated universe, but I have to admit, I wish they had gone a little harder with it. It easily could have been a bigger event that ties in more of the major characters from the MAU, but limiting it to 3 episodes towards the end of Spider-Man is a bit disappointing. But it was definitely cool to get some top-notch Doctor Doom action in this show, one of the greatest villains of all time who is yet to be properly utilized in any movie, sadly. It was interesting to see them reconcile some of the stuff they had set up previously as well, like Black Cat talking to Cap about the super soldier serum. But I think what kind of rubbed me the wrong way about this adaptation is they revealed it all to simply be a test for Spider-Man's leadership, to see if he was the right person to lead the way in the final 2-part story, Spider Wars. And while I actually like what they did with Spider Wars, it felt weird to me to adapt such a monumental comic book story like Secret Wars and simply make it a precursor to your Spider-Man version. Though Spider-Man is far and away my favorite superhero, so I can't complain too much. The Spider Wars arc is super interesting on its own. Basically, they reveal that in an alternate dimension, Carnage has infected a Spider-Man / Peter Parker and is terrorizing New York City, and it'll take a team of Spider people to take him down. And there is no question that this Spidey Carnage design, super rad. This really was Spider-Verse before Spider-Verse, which kind of rules. There's a mutated Peter with those extra arms we saw earlier in the show, a Spidey that uses Doc Ock's arms, a tech billionaire Peter Parker who uses this rad spider armor, which, side note, is a really awesome costume in the Spider-Man PS4 game, and they even throw Ben Reilly into the mix. Man, the Scarlet Spider costume is another one that I love, 100% one of my favorite costumes. I really hope we get to see this character in the upcoming Spider-Verse movies, though they did my guy dirty here, which admittedly is understandable since this was from the 90s. When Ben explains his entire character history, basically recapping the much maligned Clone Saga, Peter retorts with this quip.
This is starting to sound like a bad comic book plot.
Oof, brutal. but I really like seeing all of these Spideys in action to try and stop the Carnage variant of themselves. With the current state of superhero movies, this stuff all sounds so far ahead of its time, especially considering the commentary they made about this tech billionaire version of Peter Parker, who, though wildly successful, is shown to be a poor leader because of his easier life path. He's portrayed as a version of Peter who never lost Uncle Ben and therefore never learned the true meaning of with great power comes great responsibility. It's pretty interesting stuff, just don't let the MCU Spidey haters hear about it. Very weirdly, they also finally introduced Gwen Stacy as alternate tech Peter's fiancée in the literal final episode of the show. Though I missed her throughout the series, it was nice that they at least gave her something. They also top it off with a pretty cheesy sequence where Spider-Man goes to the dimension where he's just a comic book character and he literally meets Stan Lee.
It's been great meeting you. Take care of yourself.
You too, Spider-Man. Farewell and good luck.
This is a cute send-off, but with unresolved plot lines in the show, it feels like it could have been better utilized. Overall, the two-part Spider-Wars story really is a strong final arc for the series, it just doesn't feel final. The show ends on a cliffhanger with Madam Web telling Peter they're going to go save Mary Jane.
And I think you are finally entitled to some happiness.
Amen to that, dear lady. Amen to that.
This is just a bit of a tough pill to swallow. After losing MJ throughout the series 3 times, we don't get to see them actually reunite. It bummed me out as a kid, and it bums me out now. And that is how Spider-Man the Animated Series ends. For better or worse. The show wasn't always perfect. They take a lot of creative liberties with the comic books, and not always in the most effective ways, and sometimes it felt like the show was kind of reiterating the same things over and over again, having MJ disappear 3 separate times. They even showcased the Spider-Man origin on like 3 different occasions in 3 different ways, which was a bit confusing. Did they just want an excuse to make sure kids know the origin? Who knows? The truth is, though they fly a bit off the rails in some aspects, this is an incredibly strong adaptation of Spider-Man, mostly thanks to its understanding of the characters. For so many people, these versions of the characters defined them for years, and fortunately they did a great job developing them. Their designs are iconic alongside the legendary logo. This version of Spidey was not only all over TV, but there was tons of amazing merchandise, including multiple video games on NES, Super Nintendo, Genesis, N64, and PS1, and I think that the characters who were a major focus in the show fully went on to influence how the Raimi trilogy was approached. The show notably featured Mary Jane as the primary love interest and had close to no appearances of Gwen Stacy, which I think was likely one of the reasons they opted for MJ instead of Gwen in the films. I didn't even know who Gwen Stacy was when I was a kid, and I think they realized that a lot of other kids didn't either. And just like this show, the first Raimi film recreates the Gwen Stacy bridge sequence with Mary Jane in her place. This series truly introduced an entire generation to Spider-Man. It's without question one of the reasons I grew to love the character so much, and definitely a huge reason he's popular to this very day. Because this show is very much a product of its time, I can't say it's my favorite iteration of Spider-Man, but it's definitely very high on my list. This is undoubtedly an incredible portrayal of Peter Parker, a character whose struggles stem from his attempts to balance happiness and righteousness, a character who is put through the ringer time and time again only to come out stronger. It's just a shame we didn't get to see him be happy in the end, simply teasing that he could be happy. But maybe that's a lesson in itself. And before you mention it, yes, there is a follow-up series called Spider-Man Unlimited, but its base level is like 10 times more bonkers than even the craziest stuff in the animated series. But I definitely plan on covering it eventually because it does some pretty interesting stuff, all things considered. Also, it's only 13 episodes. All right, that's it. Peace. Spider-Man Unlimited is arguably the weirdest Spider-Man adaptation of all time. Arguably. Written as a loose follow-up to Spider-Man the Animated Series of the 90s, and I do mean loose, this series took an entirely different approach to telling a Spidey story. I would argue that this show nearly feels like it was written as an entirely different show with its own characters and lore, and then they decided to just drop Spidey and a few recognizable Spider-Man characters into the mix. Now there's no evidence that this is what they did, but it does kind of feel like it. And that isn't necessarily a criticism either, because while it is absolutely an anomaly in the long list of Spider-Man animated series, it has a ton of charm and some really interesting characters. Plus, we're about to see this version of Spidey again in the upcoming Across the Spider-Verse film. Wild times. So, join me as we dive deep into the absurdity of Spider-Man Unlimited. Spider-Man Unlimited had a very tumultuous pre-production, one in which the concept of the series shifted around multiple times. You would think that after the success of Spider-Man the Animated Series, and with that series ending on a cliffhanger, you'd do a proper follow-up, and while this is technically a follow-up, it doesn't exactly feel like it. But even before they landed on the premise, there were different ideas in play. Initially, it was meant to be a low-budget adaptation of the first 26 issues of the original run of the Amazing Spider-Man comic books. However, with Sony and Marvel's production of Sam Raimi's Spider-Man film in the works, they were barred from adapting these stories and couldn't even use the original Spidey suit for the duration of the show. After this, they even toyed with the idea of doing a Spider-Man 2099 adaptation starring Miguel O'Hara, which is especially interesting given Miguel's prominence in the upcoming Across the Spider-Verse film and the inclusion of Spider-Man Unlimited in that movie. However, they opted against this story and instead crafted a new narrative far away from the original comics run set on a parallel world called Counter-Earth. The initial idea for their Counter-Earth story was that on Counter-Earth, Uncle Ben had never died, and therefore that Earth's Peter Parker did not have the moral fortitude to resist the symbiote suit, eventually becoming Venom. So when our Peter arrives and tries to meet up with Counter Peter, he's actually met with the antagonist of the entire series. And honestly, to me, this idea sounds great. Potentially exploring Peter through a parallel version who has faltered years before Spider-Verse, mind you. And even the idea of Uncle Ben being a supporting character, this just had a ton of potential if you ask me. I really love the way writer-producer Will Munio described this arc for Peter. Dealing with the Counter-Earth Spidey/Venom was intended to be the main subplot, and by the end, Peter would have gone home with the knowledge that the hardships of his origin had made him the good man he'd become. Sounds like some quality Spider-Man to me. However, the folks at Marvel panicked because of the poor reception of the Clone Saga in the comic books and forbid them from doing a series with multiple Peter Parkers, which, yes, is very stupid, especially now given the success of Spider-Verse and No Way Home. So after adjusting and adapting their ideas to remove the parallel Parker, they landed on the story that we all know and love, or at least the one that some of us have seen. Interestingly, while the 90s animated series used a combination of digital ink and cell animation, this series switched entirely to cell animation. The style is notably different, and there's a lot of charm. I particularly love the way it uses pitch black for the shadows and shading on characters. It gives some of it almost a blacklight poster vibe. It's cool. The series premiered in October 1999, and over the next 2 weeks aired 3 total episodes. However, due to struggling ratings compared to rival shows, they ended up shelving the series and relaunching it about a year later in late 2000, this time airing all 13 episodes. The series definitely tries to be cooler and edgier than the previous animated series, and the title sequence really highlights this, with a synthy, futuristic new theme song and some pretty stylish visuals. The 2-part premiere, titled Worlds Apart, opens revealing John Jameson's plan to use a warp drive to travel to the newly discovered Counter-Earth.
There, Alita discovered an exact duplicate of our world, the Counter-Earth.
It's also described as being on the far side of the sun. They don't really go into any further detail explaining why an exact duplicate of Earth exists within the solar system, or why it requires a warp drive to reach the other side of the sun, but that's what they went with. We'll get more into the exact duplicate nature of Counter-Earth later, because it gets kind of wild. As John Jameson takes off in his shuttle, Venom and Carnage stow away on board, and Peter jumps into action to attempt to stop them. This is the single moment in Unlimited where we hear the previous iconic Spidey theme.
What could possibly be?
Interestingly, Venom and Carnage are both shown to have entirely new abilities, appearing to have no host bodies at all.
Hey, you two could never morph like that before.
It's revealed later that they are still using Brock and Cassidy's bodies, but the way they turn entirely into pure symbiote goo definitely had me confused for a minute. So Spidey is unable to stop the symbiote duo, they board the ship, and John calls for help before going through the portal. And with Spidey floating back down to Earth, as you might expect, Jonah Jameson blames the entire thing on Spider-Man and puts out a $10 million reward to identify or capture him. Wild. The thing that cracked me up here is that the entire city really does turn on Spider-Man. Dude couldn't even save a cat from a tree without getting maced. He saves a woman and her baby from falling to their death, and firefighters immediately turn their hoses on, and he still saves one of their lives. I do think this aspect is a pretty solid setup for the series. It plays off a lot of the Spidey tropes we've come to love and expect, that being Spider-Man is an absolutely thankless job. For Peter, doing the right thing is not often rewarded. And I like that this idea immediately reaches a boiling point as a catalyst for the series' premise. And the world actually ends up believing that Spidey died in the firefighting incident, which gives him the opportunity to leave Counter-Earth and try to save John Jameson from the symbiote duo. So Peter makes himself a sick new suit.
This year's fully loaded model features nanotechnology, discreetly borrowed from the lab of Reed Richards.
A nice Reed Richards name drop. Plus, as it turns out, this started the nanotechnology trend that everybody absolutely hates in the MCU. Thanks, Spidey. But man, I do love this suit design. Maybe one of my favorite Spider-Man suits ever. Spidey hijacks another shuttle with slight resistance from a jetpack sporting Nick Fury, and he heads to Counter-Earth. They do a good job table setting Peter's departure from Earth for the most part, and though the series is about to fly off the rails into entirely new territory, it's still rooted in Spidey as a character.
Remember what Uncle Ben said, MJ? With great power comes great responsibility.
There are some really gorgeous shots of Peter approaching Counter-Earth, but this is where it truly starts to feel like he's thrust into a different series entirely. His ship is tractor beamed down to Counter-Earth's New York City, and he's confronted with these guys.
We are the Knights of Wundagore. I am known to all as Lord Tiger.
I told you, it feels like an entirely separate franchise. This planet is filled with both humans and beings called Bestials, these 4 knights being particularly powerful in the hierarchy. There's a bear lady named Ursula, a ram dude named Sir Ram, and this woman named Lady Vermin, who they say is a rat lady, but like, where's the rat? And she's super into Spidey too.
We should not do battle, stranger. For you are most fair to Lady Vermin's eyes.
And you are most rat-like to mine own.
Honestly, I love it when an antagonist is horned up for Spidey, so I'm glad they kept this trope even in this unusual setting. Speaking of unusual setting, I really like the sequence where Spidey recognizes how different Counter-Earth actually is, bouncing off of hover cars in traffic, realizing everyone is an animal person.
What is this? The Manhattan Island of Dr. Moreau?
Honestly, this is one of the best Spidey quips I have ever heard in my life. Incredible stuff. Eventually, Spidey is captured by the Knights of the Wundagore, and man, I do not understand how these dudes live in Manhattan and talk like this.
But be he human or bestial, 'tis certain that he is a valiant warrior.
But then we're introduced to the real series antagonist, the High Evolutionary, though not in person yet. But this is the exact stuff I'm talking about when I say this feels like a separate franchise that Spidey was dropped into. Everything about how these people speak, their goals, their ridiculously over-designed armor, it feels like a different show. And maybe that was intentional. Spidey is a fish out of water after all, so maybe they were trying to convey that to the audience as blatantly as possible. That being said, the entire bestial idea is the biggest ask as an audience member, at least for me. I know that's silly coming from someone who also talks about BoJack Horseman regularly, but I think it has more to do with the way it's implemented into the already existing Spidey world and lore. Counter-Earth being an exact duplicate that is simply on the far side of the sun is already a funny premise, but that same Counter-Earth being filled with anthropomorphic animal people is kind of a hat on a hat, right? It's a shame they didn't make this show after the rise of online furry culture, because it probably would have gotten like 6 seasons. And unfortunately, the entire bestial idea doesn't have a particularly satisfying explanation either. The High Evolutionary apparently came to this planet seeking utopia. They don't say where he came from, just that he came here seeking utopia and was disappointed that all he found was the same war and conflict that he was used to.
To have my paradise, I would have to build it myself.
But apparently, the perfect society consists of animal-human hybrids of the High Evolutionary's design. He claims they're stronger and better and free from the problems created by humans without really elaborating on why. But I guess they have built this crazy futuristic city, so there's that. But the city is also New York City, because exact duplicate, I guess. But obviously the entire conflict in this series is that it is not a perfect society, as the Bestials have relegated humans to the lowest levels of the city, or what they call the basement. And so Spidey's main allies are a team of rebels led by John Jameson, who rescue him from the High Evolutionary. There are 3 main rebels other than John, and the show actually does eventually give them all pretty compelling backstories. There's Karen O'Malley, the most normal named rebel, Daniel Bromley, who just goes by Bromley, and of course, Git Hoskins. After being experimented on as a kid, Git now looks like a mummy, but he has complete control over his bandages, almost Mr. Fantastic style. A real ragtag group if I don't say so myself. And somehow, all led by John Jameson, who came to Counter-Earth very recently. Not sure how he secured that gig. I did like how skeptical Jameson was that this was actually Spidey though, which leads to this question, and in my opinion, a potentially big problem that they conveniently wrote around.
Who's the punk photographer that always gets those great pictures of you for the Daily Bugle?
Peter Parker.
Okay, the problem here is that by the end of these first 2 episodes, Peter is now living on Counter-Earth in the basement. He ends up having multiple mutual friends with John Jameson and living with one of them. All it would have taken is a character mentioning Peter a single time, and Jameson would have been able to figure out that he's Spider-Man. And honestly, maybe he should have. There are a few episodes where it feels very convenient that it isn't brought up or revealed to him. Peter's very lucky he didn't run into him on the street. So the other big players in this season are of course Venom and Carnage, who came to Counter-Earth to fulfill their own symbiote-related master plan. They're temporarily working for the High Evolutionary, but really only to further their own scheme. I gotta say, while I do mostly like Venom's design in this show, I kinda hate Carnage. He looks so cool in the comics and in the previous animated series, but in this they make him this big, angular, lumbering skeleton thing. Honestly, he kind of reminds me of those gigantic Home Depot skeletons. Not really a fan, but those are most of the major players in the battle for Counter-Earth, save for a couple important ones who we will meet later. And they wrap up the 2-part premiere introducing us to the important players in Peter's personal life on Counter-Earth. Peter saves a kid named Shane from one of the High Evolutionary's sentry robots, and his mother, a doctor named Naoko, treats his injuries. Peter ends up staying with them during his time on Counter-Earth and forms a great, genuine bond with them both. This gets pretty interesting later too, but we'll get there. So, as you may have noticed, talking through the very beginning of this series required a lot of description and recap. Usually when we talk about these Spider-Man series, we're talking about characters, scenarios, stories, and lore that we're all mostly familiar with in one way or another. It's usually just about how they adapted elements we already know. But this is one of the most unusual Spidey shows because the vast majority of the story is new territory. New planet, new characters, new species, new lore. Everything is completely unfamiliar, which can actually be really exciting from an audience perspective, but it also means I do have to do a lot more table setting to talk about the show compared to other Spider-Man series. In fact, the only characters who show up regularly that actually come from the Spider-Man stories we know are Peter himself, John Jameson, Venom, and Carnage. Now, there will be a few more familiar villains coming up, but they're all Counter-Earth twisted versions, different characters entirely. But now that we've set the table, talking through the rest of the season shouldn't be quite as laborious. And while it was a lot to convey, the 2 premiere episodes did do an effective job setting up the stakes and establishing countless new characters and concepts. I also really dig the way the series uses these comic book panel chyrons for transitions and establishing locations. Such a simple idea that is super effective and helps convey the comic booky nature of the series really well. The first time I watched this show, it was shortly after finishing the 90s animated series, so it took me a bit to get used to Rino Romano's take on Peter Parker, but the more I watched the show, the more I really grew to appreciate his performance. I think he makes a really solid Peter and Spidey. Crazy enough, Rino would go on to play Bruce Wayne / Batman a few years later in the animated series The Batman. Are there any other voice actors who have played both Peter Parker and Bruce Wayne? What a resume. I did laugh pretty hard at the opening of the 3rd episode. In the end of the 2nd episode, Naoko tells Peter he can stay with them rent-free for a couple of weeks while he gets on his feet, and then immediately in the 3rd episode, she is demanding the rent. I guess no matter what version of Earth Peter is on, somebody's angry about the rent. Unfortunately, their argument upsets Shane, who runs away, and when going after him, Naoko is pulled into the sewers by this big green symbiote thing, which sets the stage for what I think is a pretty great 3rd episode. Enter Green Goblin, but not the one we know. Counter-Earth has its own Goblin, and he isn't a villain, he's a fellow vigilante. I actually really love this version of the character. He's maybe slightly over-designed like some of the other original characters in the show, but I find his over-design much more charming, and giving him wings rather than a glider fits in with the whole bestial aspect of Counter-Earth really well. But he's got a very fun personality, and the sort of reluctant team-up aspect of his relationship with Spidey really works for me. Spidey is obviously skeptical because he looks like regular Earth's Green Goblin, and this Goblin is skeptical of Spidey because he looks like Venom and Carnage.
Right, you're not with Venom and Carnage. You're a completely unrelated superpowered guy in a spider suit.
There are a few characters who Spidey has to reluctantly team up with over the series, and it's just a dynamic that works for me. Goblin is probably my favorite of all of them. They have some really quality back and forth banter. However, one of the weirder quirks is that this Green Goblin just sort of throws out random pop culture quotes.
It's not easy being green. Hidey-ho, neighborinos. Rumors of my demise are greatly exaggerated.
So, to recap, those quotes are Kermit the Frog, Ned Flanders, and Mark Twain. Does this imply that the Muppets, The Simpsons, Simpsons and an alternate version of Mark Twain all exist on Counter-Earth? Or is this guy just like the weirdest wordsmith to ever exist? But regardless, Goblin's few appearances are a genuine highlight of Spider-Man Unlimited. It's a really cool take on the character, and I really dug the action when he and Spidey team up. This early sequence where Spidey makes a huge web shield and Goblin launches his explosives from out behind it is really dope. And there's a great shot towards the end where Goblin flies Spidey out of the collapsing underground base. I also really liked the very heavy implication that Goblin is actually Hector Jones, Shane's father, and Naoko's ex-husband. Though this was never explicitly realized within the text of the show, it was very obvious that this was the case. Goblin is immediately more familiar with both Naoko and Shane than you'd expect. Plus, there's this line at the end of the episode after they save Naoko, who says she hopes that she sees him again.
I hope so too, my love.
So yeah, if this isn't Hector, he's just creepy. There are actually a couple of Spidey Unlimited comics, and one of them contradicts this, saying Shane's father is actually a bestial version of Wolverine, but I don't think we can consider those canon because it is so painfully obvious that the series was setting up the Hector Goblin reveal. And it's a genuine shame they never got further with that either, because I think the whole Peter, Naoko, Hector triangle could have been really interesting. Peter's relationship with Shane and Naoko was an aspect of Unlimited that really worked for me, for the most part. The way both Naoko and Shane slowly started to respect Peter was really well done. Initially, Naoko didn't trust Peter would be able to get her the rent, and Shane actually pretty vocally called him a wuss when they reminisced about how Spidey saved Naoko from the symbiotes.
Yeah, you called the police. It's okay, Peter. You wanted to help.
And obviously, this is a common Spidey problem. Peter disappears because he has to help as Spidey, so people think that Peter is a coward.
I can't believe Peter is such a coward, running off like that.
He didn't run, Mom. He's just taking pictures. You'll see.
But as you can see, over the course of the season, Naoko and Shane both come around on Peter.
I told you he wasn't a coward.
And you were right, Shane. I am so glad.
And Peter is even shown spending quality one-on-one time with Naoko and Shane, giving Shane the kind of support a father figure would.
The longer I'm stuck on this planet, the more Shane and Naoko feel like family to me.
But if I'm being honest, it also feels like a bit of a missed opportunity. Because while they do blatantly say that Peter sees them as family and is even attracted to Naoko, the series also places MJ back on Earth waiting for Peter. And obviously, it's hard to just write off Peter's longtime love interest, but I sort of wish they had somehow for this series, because one of the majorly important aspects of any Spidey media is that they have to show him truly struggle to balance his personal life and his superhero life. And to me, the highest stakes instances of this are always related to Peter's love life. How does Peter fumble the bag because of his great responsibility? And while there certainly are aspects of this in his relationship with Naoko and Shane, I think if they had been able to fully embrace a romantic relationship, it would have increased the stakes significantly. Instead, they sort of have this half in the bag situation where Peter and Naoko definitely have feelings for each other, but because of a character on another planet that literally only appeared in the pilot episode, they can't fully explore a romance. It actually makes me wish that Unlimited had more blatantly embraced the end of Spider-Man the Animated Series, where Peter had yet to find Mary Jane after she was thrown through the Goblin's portal. Or, if you don't want to be that directly tied to those stories, just have Mary Jane tell Peter she can't have a long-distance relationship across the solar system with him. I mean, that's pretty reasonable, and it opens up the series to the romantic drama that generally works really well for Spider-Man. Though there are a couple instances where they played the existing circumstances pretty well.
Don't worry, MJ.
MJ?
Sorry, my mistake.
But ironically, I also felt they stayed too true to other aspects of Spidey's mainstays where they could have afforded to differentiate themselves on Counter-Earth, particularly that they just have Peter continue to take photos of Spider-Man for a living, even on this entirely different planet. I guess it was just initially a little bit of a stretch for me that Spidey would show up and immediately be the most in-demand photos in Counter New York, enough so that Peter can make an entire living on it. And I guess this isn't all that implausible, but straight up replacing a character as iconic as Jonah Jameson in the exact same role is not an easy task.
$100 a piece, final offer.
Mr. Mineo, do you mind if I call you JJ?
They actually named and designed Peter's new boss after Unlimited's lead producer, Will Munio, which is a funny inside joke, but I cannot pretend the character is even remotely as memorable as Jonah Jameson. It makes me think more than anything that maybe they should have found a new angle for Peter's employment while on Counter-Earth, especially because this was just another way Peter should have been easily figured out by John Jameson. Peter's name is in the paper under every picture of Spider-Man. I mean, come on. Or if they're committed to the photography gig, just use more direct parallel characters characters on Counter Earth, like they initially planned with Counter Peter. Just throw an alternate Jonah into the mix. That could have also made for some interesting drama with John Jameson. Though ultimately, I do really enjoy the alternate Spidey villains that are parallel without being the exact same characters. I already brought up Goblin, but there are also Kraven, Vulture, and Electro parallels that all sort of do their own thing. Counter Earth Kraven is simply known as the Hunter and probably has the least unique spin on any of these parallel villains, but still has a very solid design. He basically works as a mercenary for anyone who will hire him, including Bestials and the High Evolutionary. And as you'd expect, he's tasked with capturing Spider-Man. Electro is a bit more fun, the one example of a parallel villain who is actually a Bestial, though they don't ever fully vocalize what he is. My initial thought is that he's a literal electric eel, which would be dope, but he's kind of more lizard-like. He doesn't have all that much going on for him outside of the cool look though. Vulture gets a bit more of a unique Counter-Earth backstory that I actually enjoyed, and like Goblin, this version is actually more of a hero than a villain. Vulture grew up a rich kid, so rich that the other Bestial kids were cool hanging with him, but his actual best friend was a kid named Cliff, the son of his family's housekeeper. But while hanging around with the Bestials, they would regularly terrorize humans, and one day they ended up lighting Cliff's house on fire.
But the look on his face changed my life. I vowed to do everything I could to stop human suffering.
Though I gotta say, Spidey is absolutely in full hypocrite mode talking to Vulture about this crime fighting here. Like, how did he even get these words out seriously?
A lot of folks feel strongly about something, but they don't take it to the streets.
Really, Spidey? You're gonna lecture someone about taking things to the streets? So much for great responsibility. Actually, if I'm being honest, there are a handful of moments in the show that rub me the wrong way in terms of Spidey's motivations. He sticks around to help Jameson and the rebels, but if Jameson didn't want to stay, Spidey would 100% have left Counter Earth.
Look, John, there's nothing I'd like better than to see the beasties take a nosedive, but this isn't our fight.
I feel like what they were going for is the idea that being so far from home in such an unfamiliar place really challenges Peter's moral fortitude in regard to with great power comes great responsibility, which is an idea I like fine on paper. I just wish they had shown more of a complete growth cycle for Peter to come around and realize that he's wrong. Because as is, there are just a series of moments like these where Spider-Man is acting very un-Spider-Man-like. There's even a perfect moment where they could have shown Spidey's epiphany. In the 9th episode of the season, Peter actually gets an opportunity to take his ship back to Earth. He nearly leaves Counter Earth, but unfortunately he can't board the ship in time and uses his webbing to alter its course and basically 9/11 the High Evolutionary's technodrome-looking base. But this feels like a missed opportunity for Peter to have actually made the decision to sacrifice his ability to go home so that he can continue to help Counter Earth. As it stands, it plays out like it was his only real option, but this could have been a situation that brings his crisis of great responsibility to a close in a very satisfying way. But there are a couple of truly great episodes that showcase Peter embracing great responsibility. The first that I absolutely love is the 5th episode, Steel Cold Heart, where Peter meets one of the High Evolutionary's sentry robots called X-51, who's malfunctioning after being in service for over 20 years. Peter recognizes that X-51 has a higher level of sentience than the other robots.
Please, help.
You might be a glorified toaster, pal, but there's one request I can't turn down.
I love that Peter treats X-51 like a person, even when others won't. Jameson wants to trade him in exchange for Bromley, but Peter even stands up to his own allies to do what's right.
Hey, ground control to Major John. X-51 is not a thing, he's a person.
And after X-51 helps the rebels and they rescue Bromley, Jameson admits that he was wrong.
I owe you an apology, Spider-Man.
It's not me you should be apologizing to, John. It's X-51.
This is what I like to see out of this show. Spidey standing up for what's truly right in the face of opposition from his own allies. That's true responsibility through adversity. X-51 ends up joining the team too, and I like that their little ragtag group of rebels slowly grows as the season progresses. But the absolute crown jewel of Spider-Man Unlimited episodes is One is the Loneliest Number. Not only an incredible Spidey story, but an incredible Eddie Brock story. When Bestials steal the Venom symbiote from Brock, Eddie nearly dies, and Spidey has to help him.
But you're not Venom, are you? You're a human being.
But because of how thoroughly Eddie bonded with the symbiote, he actually needs it to survive. So the dilemma Spidey finds himself in is that in order to do the right thing and save Brock, he has to ensure the survival of one of his greatest enemies and threats.
But I can't sit back and watch a man die.
Not even you, Eddie.
But the lengths that Peter goes to maintain that responsibility and save Eddie are what make this an even greater story. After securing the symbiote, Peter realizes that it cannot survive for long without a human host. So, in order to get it back to Eddie before it perishes, he dons the black costume for the first time in years, acting as the symbiote's life support. And Eddie's half of this story is incredible as well, as Naoko and Shane actually appeal to Eddie's humanity. And though he's dying, his sweeter side comes out through his interactions with Naoko and Shane.
You know, for a minute there, I was starting to like feeling human again.
Eddie actually ends up accepting his impending death, happy that he's going to die a human and not be consumed by the symbiote again. Unfortunately, Carnage has other plans, but Eddie was fully willing to die even with the symbiote in front of him, the last chance to save his life.
No! I want to stay Eddie Brock, whatever the price!
This is just so heartbreaking and honestly one of my favorite Venom stories ever. And ultimately, Eddie is the other character in this episode to showcase great responsibility. In order to save Naoko and Shane, he re-merges with the symbiote, even though it means giving up his chance to die with dignity, to die as Eddie Brock. We've seen stories where Eddie gets redemption as Venom and sacrifices himself before, but the idea that Eddie has to sacrifice his own humanity to help the people he cares about, to give up his own dignity and become Venom again, even though it's the last thing he wants, that is an amazing Venom story. Eddie embracing his great power and his great responsibility. This episode, in my mind, justifies this entire series' existence. One of my favorite animated episodes of Spidey that I've ever seen. But overall, there were a lot of issues with Unlimited that kept it from truly shining for me. The buy-in for the entirely new world, the Bestials in general, a slew of new unfamiliar side characters that were only occasionally interesting, and, in my opinion, a very lackluster main antagonist. While each of the three major Rebel characters, Git Hoskins, Daniel Bromley, and Karen O'Malley, all got some decently fleshed out backstories eventually, none of them really felt all that compelling outside of the episodes devoted to their histories. Git's backstory was tragic, Bromley had a tumultuous history with his brother, and Karen's ultimate blood connection to the High Evolutionary. These were all interesting, but none of them made me really connect to the characters on a level that I'd have liked. Occasionally, the Knights of Wundagore had some compelling character traits. I particularly liked Lord Tiger, who seemed to think for himself about each individual situation and never went along with the other knights' plan just because. Lady Vermin's flirtations with Spidey were fun too, but there's not all that much more to it. And sadly, outside of one great Venom episode, the symbiote's overarching story did not do much for me either. Though I expect that had we eventually seen more in regards to the Synoptic and its plan to further expand the symbiote hive mind, this maybe could have been interesting. And of course, the saddest of all, the series ends on a brutal cliffhanger, as symbiotic spores launch out of Counter-Earth, threatening to end all life on the planet. And that is literally how the series ends. Damn, how many of these Spider-Man cartoons just end on cliffhangers? Can somebody finish a damn Spider-Man story? Ultimately, I do think Spider-Man Unlimited was a very cool experiment that didn't entirely pay off. I'm glad it exists, there are some great stories in here, but I can see the groundwork for better stories laying beneath some that ended up feeling lackluster. I think that writer Will Munio's quote about his time on the show sums up exactly why this didn't quite work. I got to work with some great people, and there are some nice action sequences in some of the episodes, but I wish we could have done the real Spider-Man as originally planned. And that's the main change I would have liked, just being allowed the honor of doing a straightforward adaptation of the books I loved as a kid. I think that's hard to argue with. And even after they were denied this, they came up with a pretty compelling Counter-Earth premise with an antagonistic Peter Parker, and even that idea was thrown away due to Marvel's own misguided perceptions of what the fans wanted. And even after all of that, they ended up canning the show on a cliffhanger, never allowing the creative team to hit their stride in the premise that they had to craft around all of the interference. It seems like the creative team was stifled at every turn while making the series, and while I do think some great stuff came out of it, they were never really given the opportunity to make something they believed in. And that is a shame, because there was some very creative and satisfying work done on Spider-Man Unlimited. And while I do think it's likely going to just be a relatively small cameo, it's kind of exciting to me that we're going to see this version of Spidey in the Across the Spider-Verse film. I don't think we should expect anything substantial, but it's cool to know that this series' legacy lives on.